Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. A 19th century small town courtroom is packed to the brim with an eager crowd. People hanging onto every word of the witnesses, watching each subtle movement of the defendant, local media scribbling down their accounts, and a jury poised to make a verdict that will change one man's life. And then, a shocking moment that left everyone stunned. One witness would change the course of this case and cause it to go down in history. It was a pretty sensational case, as it was. The murder of a young woman by her husband, reportedly so he could wed a new bride, already his fourth, an attempted cover-up of the crime where the young woman was hastily buried to hide the murder before anyone could properly examine the body. A tale filled with intrigue and small-town gossip, whispers on the street corners, and sensational stories at tea time. But as far as murders go, it was pretty ordinary. If it wasn't for the testimony given on that fateful day in June 1897, it would have only lived forever in the pages of a small-town newspaper, buried in obscurity among the reports of school graduations, farmstead sales, and local club meetings. Instead, the trial of Erasmus Shue in Greenbrier, West Virginia, would go down in infamy as the only known case in the USA where the testimony of a ghost was used to convict someone of murder. However, it's not the only case where such testimony has been used as a key piece of evidence. If the Greenbrier Ghost case rings a bell, you may have heard parts of the story before. It's the subject of many popular culture adaptations, including plays, musicals, novels, and even an episode of Drunken History. The case is even featured on a historical plaque in West Virginia, one of the most famous historical events coming out of Little Greenbrier County. On this episode, we will cover this fascinating case in some detail and consider how a ghost came to be admitted into evidence. But we will also explore 3 other cases where similar evidence was used in the court of law, albeit with less success. It turns out that the supernatural has made more appearances on the stand than we may realize. But before we get to that, I got to spend quite a bit of time outdoors over the long weekend, and I noticed something, and I wonder if you have as well wherever you live. And that's that the leaves are starting to turn. Which for us, of course, means spooky season is not far off the horizon. Of course, we have a whole slate of adventures for you to take part in: ghost tours, investigations, and at least 2 major announcements yet still to come. But right now, I want to speak to our listeners in and around Toronto, as we have 2 big deals going on that are about to come to an end. The first is tickets for our brand new Alone in the Dark experience at the Village at Black Creek are 15% off when you purchase tickets before Saturday, September 9th. You can use the promo code CONTACT at checkout to save that 15% off tickets. Now, I had a chance to be up at Black Creek Pioneer Village this past week. It had been a few years since I had been there, and it is just as spooky as ever. This is a great opportunity to try to connect with the spirits at a very legitimately haunted location. The other deal that will be coming to an end soon is another 15% off offer for our Toronto's Haunted Harbor experience. Now, on this one, we partner with our friends at Pirate Life for a combination storytelling and boat cruise adventure that takes you through the waters and the lagoons and even to the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse. We'll be sharing spine-tingling stories of ghost ships, shipwrecks, and monsters lurking just below the surface. If you purchase your Halloween season tickets before Friday, September 15th, you can use the promo code SPOOKYWATERS to save 15% at checkout. In addition to those special offers, of course, we have regular ghost tours running in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and we'd love to have you out this fall. For information about our Alone in the Dark experience at the Village of Black Creek, Toronto's Haunted Harbor, or any of our ghost tours or online adventures, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. We'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all of them at Haunted Walk. And if you've been enjoying our episodes, be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. Let's start in Greenbrier in 1897. The county is located in the eastern part of West Virginia in the Allegheny Mountains. Today it's known for its resorts and outdoor activities like stunning mountain vistas and championship golf courses. But back in the 19th century, it was very rural, dotted with agricultural and a booming coal mine industry. The short 4-page daily local newspaper reported on small-town matters, comings and goings of residents, the state of the crops, court schedules for petty cases, and serial fiction stories. When one resident, Zona Shu, reportedly died of natural causes, probably in childbirth, it didn't make the news. Death would have touched many people in a small community like this, but they were fairly common in a place with rudimentary healthcare. However, about a month after her demise, Zona's death was suddenly on the tongues of every local gossip, as it was reported that she was, in fact, murdered. Mary Jane Hester, Zona's mother, had compelled the court to dig up her daughter's body and do a close examination of the cause of death. The whole state of affairs wasn't sitting right with the concerned mother, and a local prosecutor was sympathetic to her cause. Sure enough, after the body was exhumed and re-examined, it was determined that Zona's neck was snapped, and she was clearly strangled to death by hand. The imprints of the fingers still visible on her delicate neck. Her husband, Erasmus, was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder, and thus began the infamous trial. At this point in the case, not many people in Greenbrier actually knew the full story. How had Mary Jane Hester persuaded the prosecutor to dig up her daughter's body? Was it a hunch? Some confession from her son-in-law? Or someone or something else that directed her to look a bit closer? All of that came out during the trial. Here are some excerpts from her testimony, edited for brevity. Question. I heard you had some dream or vision, which led to this post-mortem examination.
They saw enough themselves without me telling them. It was no dream. She came back and told me that he was mad, that she didn't have no meat cooked for supper. Well, I saw the place just exactly as she told me, and I saw blood right there where she told me. And she told me something about that meat every night she came, just as she did the first night. She came 4 times and 4 nights. But the second night, she told me that her neck was squeezed off at the first joint, and it was just as she had told me.
And this was not a dream founded upon your distressed condition of mind?
No, sir. It was no dream, for I was as wide awake as I ever was.
Then if not a dream or dreams, what do you call it?
I prayed to the Lord that she might come back and tell me what had happened, and I prayed that she might come herself and tell on him.
Do you think you actually saw her, in flesh and blood?
Yes, sire, I do. I told them the very dress that she was killed in, and when she went to leave me, she turned head completely around and looked at me like she wanted me to know all about it. And the very next time she came back to me, she told me all about it. The first time she came, she seemed that she did not want to tell me as much about it as she did afterwards. The last night she was there, she told me that she did everything she could do, and I'm satisfied that she did all of that too.
So to recap, Mary Jane Hester saw her daughter's ghost on 4 occasions, which she claims were not dreams, but rather the daughter appearing in flesh and blood before her eyes. During these visions, the ghost of Zona Shu disclosed what happened to her and how she had been murdered. Using this information, Mary Jane Hester went to the prosecutor and persuaded him to re-examine the body, specifically looking for signs of strangulation. When these details turned out to be true, Erasmus Shue was arrested, and Mary Jane Hester became the star witness to speak on behalf of her deceased daughter, who was seemingly giving direction from beyond the grave. Although this case has been remembered as a trial where the ghost actually gave evidence that led to a conviction, it wasn't quite how the case went down. In fact, the prosecutor didn't dwell on the ghost evidence and tried to lead Hester away from that aspect of the story while she was on the witness stand. It was the defense that first explored the ghost evidence in an attempt to discredit her. But the tactic backfired when Mary Jane was determined by the jury to be steadfast in her belief, credible, and a God-fearing Christian woman who would not lie under oath. We can wonder whether or not the supposed ghost of Zona Shu really did play a major role in convicting her husband of the murder. The so-called ghost evidence wasn't actually evidence and could be called hearsay. But it seems that a ghostly vision did lead investigators to digging up the body and determining it was a murder in the first place. For a case that only had circumstantial evidence pointing to the accused, it seems that Zona's testimony from the grave did result in the guilty plea, even if indirectly. Indeed, on July 11th, 1897, Erasmus was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and although a mob of angry locals tried to kill him shortly after his sentence was passed, he actually died due to illness a few years later. Skeptics of the ghost evidence have been quick to point out that there was actual physical evidence that led to Erasmus's conviction, and his incessant bragging about his womanizing ways didn't help his case. Still, Without Mary Jane's vision of her ghostly daughter, it is unknown if her true cause of death would have ever been discovered. And it's possible that Erasmus would have gotten away with murder. At the beginning of this episode, I said that the Greenbrier case was arguably the most famous use of ghost evidence, and possibly the only case in the USA where it was used to convict. But it's definitely not unique. In fact, there's a case that sounds strikingly similar just a couple decades later, a relatively short distance away in Washington, D.C. The precise details of this case are unknown, but the account of the so-called ghost witness was published across the United States in the summer of 1920. Keep in mind, this was the height of spiritualism in North America, where ordinary people were frequently using mediums, seances, and Ouija boards in an attempt to contact the dead. This is also a time when fake mediums were being investigated by police, and society was very divided over the practice of spiritualism and if it was actually harmful to people's well-being. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, we did a whole episode, 154, on fake mediums, putting the con in Conjuring, that I would highly recommend you give a listen to. In this fervor of activity and speculation, it's no surprise that these practices featured in a murder case, and people's beliefs were boldly called into question in the press. According to those scant newspaper reports, the trial happened in a superior court in the District of Columbia. It involved a man accused of murdering his wife. The mother of the murder victim was supposedly in contact with her deceased daughter through mediums and Ouija boards. Sounds a bit like Greenbrier, doesn't it? In this case, the prosecutors were sure that the young woman was murdered, but the culprit remained a mystery and there was no evidence to secure a conviction. So they allegedly advised the mother to seek out spiritual services. That led her to contacting her deceased daughter on multiple occasions with the assistance of spiritualists and their tools. During these conversations with the dead, the daughter claimed that she had acquired a metal pipe that her husband, the accused, had used to beat her to death with. It was a sensational story, but like in the Greenbrier case, the physical evidence of a beating matched what the ghostly apparition had to say. The difference here is that the mother knew her daughter was beaten to death before contacting her spirit, and skeptics seemed to question if some opportunistic mediums were attempting to profit from such a spectacle. The outcome of this trial wasn't published in the newspaper, and without considerable digging, it's not easy to determine what happened in this case. It's unlikely there was a conviction based solely on the evidence, or the case probably would have received more attention and fame. However, with the rise of spiritualism and a growing group of skeptics, this was a perfect opportunity for the media to call the practice into question and poke fun at those who thought ghosts could be reliable witnesses. But as other cases from history show, relying on guidance that supposedly came from beyond the grave had some precedent. As much as the practice might seem outlandish back then, and completely unheard of today, it was not as uncommon as you might think. Our next case brings us across the pond and back to the 18th century, not long after the failed Jacobean uprising in the Scottish Highlands. The story sounds like a thing of myth, but its details have been recounted in British and Scottish newspapers for centuries, backed up by secondary sources that have published some version of the tale over the decades, giving credence to the lore. In September 1749, an English soldier, Sergeant Davies, left his encampment to do some hunting. When he failed to return and never made an appearance with his company again, his comrades suspected foul play. But in the wild Scottish Highlands, no one could be certain of his cause for disappearing, and the case went cold. That is until 5 years later, when some damning evidence was found in the possession of two local men, Duncan Tierig and Alexander MacDonald. What led authorities to these men? Some evidence from the grave. Alexander McPherson, a local farmhand, had reported that the ghostly figure of Sergeant Davies had appeared before him sometime in 1750. The young man brushed off the apparition for the first couple nights, but it kept appearing, and he was finally persuaded to check out the story. He was led to the spot where Davies' bones were left, unburied, and over the course of a couple more visits, the ghost revealed his murderers. Whether out of duty or fear, McPherson eventually disclosed what he had learned from the phantom, and the authorities swooped in to try and solve the case. Later newspapers were quick to remind their contemporary readers that 18th century Scotland was quite a different place, where the word of a ghost might be more readily believed and admitted to the court as evidence. Reminiscent of the other two cases we've covered, while there was physical evidence supposedly linking the accused to Sergeant Davies, the only reason the evidence was discovered was thanks to a ghostly apparition. But unlike the other cases, the farmhand McPherson had no connection with the accused or the murdered, and was a completely independent third party who had come by the information innocently, or so he claimed. Eventually, the case made it to trial at the Edinburgh court, where McPherson testified about his many visits from the ghost. Another local woman corroborated the story, saying she had seen a strange, naked man enter McPherson's house on one of the nights in question. The evidence was mounting, and the two witnesses were sure of their visions. It appeared that the accused would face the gallows. That is, until McPherson was cross-examined by the defense. The young man, who only spoke Gaelic, was allegedly asked what language the ghost of Sergeant Davies spoke. He replied that it was perfect Gaelic, and he understood every single word as he would a native speaker. McPherson was nearly laughed out of the courtroom when the defense counsel retorted, "Pretty good for the ghost of an English soldier." The assumption being that an English soldier named Davies wouldn't know any Gaelic, let alone be able to fool a native speaker. Shortly after, Tierig and MacDonald were found not guilty of the crime, supposedly because of the laughable ghost story. The subsequent reports of this trial that have appeared periodically in English newspapers seem to poke fun at the superstitions of the Scottish Highlanders and suggested that relying on ghosts for evidence was ridiculous. There was a snobbery in the later reporting that discounted the many times the spirit visions were actually used. But an analysis from the Mornington Standard out of Australia in 1893 was careful to remind readers that the apparition did successfully lead McPherson to the bones and caused him to call out two accused that did have some of Davy's possessions. Had McPherson come by this information some other way? Or was McPherson the actual murderer, for reasons unknown, and had planted evidence to lead authorities in another direction? Or perhaps something from beyond the grave did lead him to successfully find two killers that had gotten away with a murder. As the Mornington Standard pointed out, we don't know what language ghosts speak when they're dead, after all, or how we might hear that communication. For our last case, we'll go back to the United States and explore an incident that thankfully did not result in a conviction. This case, from 1801, was reported on in the 1937 Bangor Daily News. The strange twists and turns fascinated the columnist Henry Buxton. The case involved an accused man, Joseph Inman, who was a recent arrival in Orono, Maine. He was suspected of murdering Oliver Holmes, possibly with some accomplices that may have included Holmes' own wife. Allegedly, Oliver Holmes had disappeared after attending a party where he had a very drunken and very heated argument with Joseph Inman. Oliver's wife, who was known for shouting much too often, had also been involved. Shortly after, Oliver was nowhere to be seen, and his disappearance was suspected by most townfolk to be murder. There wasn't much evidence against Joseph, but the community was in an uproar and demanded some kind of hearing. Back in 1801, in Orono, these kind of matters were heard in private homes, and this case took place at the residence of Colonel Eddy, with a rather vocal crowd of locals who were convinced of Joseph's guilt. The actual evidence in the case was shaky, though, until a witness stepped up to give an absolutely unbelievable account. The witness in question? William Inman, the accused son. Here is his statement, edited for brevity. I, being at a place called Marsh's Island on the Pembacop River, met John Spencer, who came in with a pint of rum. Spencer told me if I would fetch him some water, he would make some grog, which he would share with me. I took a pail in my hand and was walking towards the well when something appeared before me that seemed to be a ghost, which said, "Your father was the very man that killed me." Then the ghost walked away, and of this I am willing to take my oath. On that testimony alone, Joseph Inman was committed to jail and would face the gallows for his crime. He languished in prison for a few weeks until something even more extraordinary happened. One day, a man who looked and talked exactly like Oliver Holmes walked into the village. According to reports, children ran from the streets, women hid under their beds, and everyone shut their curtains, believing some kind of curse had befallen the village and that Oliver Holmes had come back to do some evil deed. In the end, it was not his ghost. It was just a very tired, but very alive, Oliver Holmes, who had been apparently so sick of his wife's nagging that he went off for a rest. After reading about Joseph Inman's plight in a Boston newspaper, he returned to the village so Joseph could be set free. And he was. The court even ordered restitution for the financial woes he had suffered when his assets were snatched during his 4-month imprisonment. It is unknown if William, the son who had apparently seen the ghost, ever faced any consequences. At the very least, you think it would make for some very complicated family dinners. It may be true that Erasmus Shue was the only American man convicted of murder based primarily on ghost evidence. But as we've heard today, it was far from the only murder case that involved some kind of paranormal witness. Reporting has been divided over the centuries, but most commentators were quick to point out that ghosts only seem to assist in trials. They don't actually convict people. Except in the case of Joseph Inman, physical evidence did exist to back up the ghostly claims in all of the cases we've looked at. With so many advances in technology, it would be interesting today to see some type of paranormal evidence brought up in a court of law and tried alongside things like fingerprints or DNA. However, I think we can all agree the times have changed, and despite ongoing questions about the existence of the paranormal, it is unlikely, for now, that the word of the dead would be used to convict. But at some point in the future, that all could change. Thank you so much for joining us. For information about our Alone in the Dark experience at the village of Black Creek, Toronto's Haunted Harbour, or any of our ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, and of course our online experiences, which can be done from anywhere in the world, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk. Please be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode, and Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.